Welcome back to Lore at Night, where rain gently falls and every story carries a shadow. I'm always curious to hear where in the world you're listening from, so comment that down below. Now get comfortable, and let's begin with the first story. From a distance, Briarfield looked orderly and finished, as if nothing more were expected of it. It was the kind of place where routines were inherited rather than chosen, and where disruptions traveled slowly but lingered. The morning the body was found began like most others. Traffic moved in predictable pulses as residents drove toward the highway or toward the school complex on the north side of town. There was no sense of urgency until a county road crew halted work along Willow Creek, a narrow channel that cut behind a stretch of older homes and emptied into a retention pond. One of the workers noticed something pale caught among the reeds, too still to be debris and too large to be ignored. By the time the sheriff's office arrived, the fog had begun to lift. The body lay face down at the water's edge, partially submerged, the surrounding mud disturbed in a way that suggested it had not arrived there gently. Identification came quickly. The man was Daniel Harper, 46 years old, a lifelong resident of Briarfield. He owned a small agricultural supply store near the town square and served on the zoning committee, positions that placed him within the quiet machinery of local life without ever elevating him beyond it. There were no obvious signs of a struggle visible from a distance, no blood pooled in the water, no clear wounds that announced themselves. What unsettled the first responders was the placement. Willow Creek was shallow and slow-moving, barely capable of carrying anything downstream. For Harper to have ended up there required intention, either his own or someone else's. The absence of clarity settled heavily over the scene. News traveled outward from the creek in widening circles. By mid-morning, most of Briarfield knew that something serious had happened, though details were sparse and inconsistent. Some believed Harper had fallen while walking alone. Others assumed an accident related to drinking, a theory that gained traction because it required no further explanation. The sheriff's office resisted speculation, but the restraint only amplified it. The initial examination suggested otherwise. Harper had not drowned. The coroner's preliminary assessment indicated blunt force trauma to the back of the head, delivered with enough force to render him unconscious before death. The injury was not immediately visible beneath the waterline, but it was unmistakable once examined. The creek, it became clear, was not the site of the killing but a place where the body had been left. This distinction altered the tone of the investigation, and, with it, the mood of the town. Briarfield was accustomed to minor crimes, to property disputes, and the occasional domestic call. A homicide was something that belonged elsewhere, in cities or in distant news segments. The idea that someone had been killed deliberately and quietly, then placed along a familiar walking path, unsettled, long-held assumptions about safety and familiarity. Daniel Harper's life appeared, at first glance, unremarkable. He was married, with 2 adult children who had both moved away. His store catered to local farmers, selling seed, equipment parts, and feed supplements. He was known for being meticulous and reserved, a man who kept careful records and avoided conflict when possible. Those who interacted with him regularly described him as dependable, if not particularly warm. Investigators began where routines intersected with opportunity. Harper had closed his store at its usual time the evening before his body was found. His truck was parked in the lot behind the building, locked, with nothing inside disturbed. There was no indication that he had driven to Willow Creek. The distance between the store and the creek was less than a mile, but it required leaving the main streets and walking through a residential area that thinned into trees and overgrown lots. Neighbors along that route recalled nothing out of the ordinary. No raised voices, no unfamiliar vehicles, no sounds that demanded attention. In a town where quiet was the default, silence was not evidence of absence. It was simply the background against which everything else occurred. the investigation expanded cautiously. Sheriff Thomas Reed, who had served the county for over 20 years, understood the risks of haste in a case like this. The pressure to provide answers was immediate, but the available facts resisted cohesion. There was no weapon found near the body or along the creek. No personal items were missing. Harper's wallet was in his pocket, cash untouched. Attention turned inward, toward Harper's relationships and responsibilities. His role on the zoning committee had placed him at the center of recent debates about land use on the outskirts of town. A proposed storage facility had divided opinion, pitting longtime residents against newer agricultural interests. Harper had voted in favor of the project, citing economic necessity. The decision had been contentious, though not unusually so. Investigators cataloged grievances, real and perceived. They reviewed meeting minutes, emails, and handwritten notes kept in Harper's office. None of it suggested animosity that rose to the level of violence. Disagreements in Briarfield tended to resolve themselves through attrition rather than confrontation. As the day progressed, the creek was cleared and the area reopened. Life resumed its patterns, but with a heightened awareness that something unresolved lay beneath the surface. People avoided the path along Willow Creek, choosing longer routes that kept them within sight of houses and open fields. Conversations lowered when patrol cars passed. By evening, the sheriff's office had little more than a timeline anchored by absence. Daniel Harper had left his store sometime after closing and had not been seen again. How he arrived at the creek, who accompanied him, and what occurred in the intervening hours remained unclear. The lack of witnesses was not suspicious in itself, but it narrowed the path forward. The first day ended without arrests or public declarations. What remained was a growing sense that the town had overlooked something familiar, something woven into its routines. The creek, the path, the quiet, all of it had existed unchanged for years. Now, those elements formed the backdrop of a crime that refused to announce itself, leaving investigators to work backward from still water and unanswered questions. By the second morning, the investigation had settled into a methodical pace shaped as much by caution as by uncertainty. The crime scene itself offered little more than it already had. Willow Creek revealed no hidden impressions once the waterline receded. The mud along the bank held overlapping tracks from weeks of foot traffic and maintenance work, none of which could be isolated with confidence. What remained was context, and the slow reconstruction of Daniel Harper's final hours. Phone records placed his last outgoing call at 6:42 p.m., a brief connection to a local number belonging to the agricultural co-op. The call lasted less than a minute and appeared routine. After that, there was nothing. No messages, no missed calls, no indication of distress. His phone was found in his pocket, dry and intact, suggesting it had not been exposed to water for long. Investigators inferred that the device had been on his person when he was placed at the creek, not carried there by current or chance. Security cameras around the town square provided limited assistance. One camera captured Harper locking the back door of his store just after 6:30 p.m. He walked out of frame toward the alley, his movements unhurried. There were no other images of him that evening. Briarfield's surveillance coverage thinned quickly beyond the commercial center, leaving residential streets and footpaths largely unrecorded. The absence of evidence did not point clearly toward isolation or company. Harper could have chosen to walk, as he often did when weather allowed, or he could have met someone briefly before leaving the area. Investigators considered both possibilities, aware that either interpretation risked shaping the inquiry prematurely. Attention shifted to Harper's home on the west side of town. His wife, Margaret, had been visiting their daughter in Iowa at the time of his death, a trip planned weeks in advance. The house showed no signs of disturbance, Harper's car remained in the driveway, unused. Inside, everything appeared in order. Dishes were washed, mail sorted, paperwork stacked neatly on the dining room table. If there had been urgency, it had left no trace. Colleagues and acquaintances described Harper's recent behavior as unchanged. He had attended meetings, paid invoices, and discussed harvest projections with the same measured tone he always used. No one recalled agitation or distraction. This consistency, while reassuring on the surface, complicated efforts to identify a precipitating event. There was no visible fracture line in his days, no obvious moment where routine gave way to risk. The zoning issue resurfaced repeatedly in interviews, not because it offered concrete leads, but because it represented one of the few areas where Harper had exercised influence. Several residents had expressed frustration over the storage facility proposal, though none admitted to confrontations beyond public meetings. Investigators noted the pattern without assigning it weight, aware that community disputes often appeared more severe in retrospect than they were in practice. Less prominent but equally scrutinized was Harper's business. The agricultural supply store operated on narrow margins, dependent on trust and long-standing relationships. Financial records showed modest profits and no irregularities. There were no recent disputes with customers or suppliers that suggested escalation. Still, investigators examined delivery logs and employee schedules, searching for anomalies that might indicate an unreported encounter. As the days passed, the lack of progress began to exert pressure. Rumors filled the gaps left by official silence. Some residents fixated on outsiders, pointing to unfamiliar vehicles seen near the creek weeks earlier. Others turned inward, reassessing interactions that had once seemed trivial. The investigation, though confined to evidence, could not avoid the ambient unease that now shaped perception in Briarfield. Sheriff Reed maintained a deliberate reserve in public statements, emphasizing patience and cooperation. Privately, he acknowledged the risk of stagnation. Without a clear point of entry, the case threatened to diffuse into a collection of disconnected observations. The challenge lay in determining which details mattered, and which merely reflected the town's heightened awareness. One element continued to resist easy explanation: the decision to leave Harper's body where it was found. Willow Creek was accessible but visible, its path frequented by walkers and maintenance crews. The placement suggested neither concealment nor display. It occupied an uneasy middle ground, implying familiarity with the area, but indifference to discovery. Investigators debated whether this choice reflected haste, confidence, or something more personal. As the first week drew to a close, the investigation remained anchored to absence rather than revelation. There was no suspect, no weapon, no clear motive. What persisted was a sense that the answer lay close to Harper's life as it had been lived, embedded in habits and decisions that had never before demanded scrutiny. The town adjusted around the uncertainty. Storefronts closed earlier. Evening walks along the creek ceased entirely. Briarfield continued to function, but with a new awareness that its quiet could no longer be taken at face value. For investigators, the task ahead was not to introduce complexity, but to uncover it, piece by piece, within a landscape that had always seemed deceptively simple. The second week brought a subtle shift in the investigation, not through discovery but through reconsideration. With no external threat identified, investigators began to question the assumptions that had guided the early days. The absence of chaos in Daniel Harper's life no longer suggested safety. Instead, it hinted at something quieter, more embedded, the kind of conflict that did not announce itself through raised voices or visible disruption. Re-examination became the guiding principle. Phone records were reviewed again, this time not for urgency but for pattern. Harper's calls clustered tightly around business hours, with few personal contacts outside his immediate family. One number appeared repeatedly in the weeks before his death, a local contractor named William Porter, whose company specialized in land grading and drainage work. The frequency was not alarming on its own. Porter had recently bid on projects connected to the proposed storage facility. Still, investigators noted that the calls often occurred after official meetings had concluded. Porter was interviewed and cooperative. He described routine discussions about timelines and specifications, nothing contentious. His demeanor was calm, his account consistent. There was no evidence placing him near Willow Creek on the night of Harper's death. The interaction, while noted, did not advance the case. It did, however, reinforce a growing suspicion that Harper's public role might have extended into less visible negotiations. Investigators turned to Harper's handwritten notes, stored in a filing cabinet at his home. The entries were orderly, dated, and precise, reflecting his reputation for meticulousness. Among lists of expenses and meeting reminders were several references to drainage easements and setback adjustments, written in the margins rather than logged formally. These annotations suggested unresolved concerns, issues that had not progressed through official channels. The relevance was unclear, but the tone differed from Harper's usual neutrality. The notes conveyed persistence rather than obligation, as though he were attempting to resolve something resistant to process. Investigators considered whether these efforts had placed him in a position of quiet opposition, one not captured in public records. Attention returned to the path along Willow Creek. Though no witnesses had come forward initially, detectives canvassed the area again, this time focusing on routine rather than anomaly. A retired couple recalled seeing Harper walking there occasionally in the evenings, usually alone, sometimes stopping to look at the water levels after heavy rain. This detail aligned with his interest in drainage issues and suggested the creek was not an arbitrary location in his life. The implication unsettled investigators. If Harper frequented the area, his presence there would not have raised suspicion. A meeting arranged along the path could have seemed ordinary, even prudent, given the privacy it afforded. The creek's familiarity reframed the placement of the body, shifting it from indifference to intention. Further examination of Harper's schedule revealed a gap on the evening of his death. He had no recorded obligations after closing the store, but his calendar included a penciled mark, undated and unlabeled, beside that day. It was the only such mark in weeks of entries. The absence of explanation drew attention precisely because of its rarity. As these fragments accumulated, the investigation narrowed its focus. Rather than seeking an unknown assailant, detectives began to consider someone whose interactions with Harper were unremarkable on the surface, but charged beneath it. The question was no longer who might have encountered him by chance, but who might have expected to. The town, meanwhile, grew restless. The initial shock had settled into a low-grade vigilance. People speculated less openly, but listened more carefully, measuring each new detail against their own experiences. Harper's name surfaced in conversations not as a victim, but as a presence, someone whose quiet authority was being reassessed in hindsight. By the end of the second week, investigators had no definitive suspect, but they had abandoned the notion of randomness. The crime appeared increasingly deliberate, shaped by familiarity and timing rather than impulse. Whatever had happened along Willow Creek was not the result of sudden violence, but of a convergence planned carefully enough to leave almost nothing behind. The investigation stood at a threshold. The pieces were still disconnected, but their edges had begun to align. What remained was the task of understanding how Daniel Harper's private efforts intersected with someone else's unresolved interests, and why that intersection had led, quietly and irrevocably, to the edge of the creek. The third phase of the investigation unfolded without urgency but with increasing precision. By then, the question was no longer whether Daniel Harper had met someone intentionally on the night of his death. It was why that meeting had been necessary at all. The answer, investigators believed, lay in the narrow space between Harper's official responsibilities and his informal efforts to resolve matters before they hardened into conflict. The drainage issues resurfaced repeatedly. Briarfield's expansion on its southern edge had strained an aging system of culverts and easements that were poorly documented and inconsistently maintained. Harper, through both his business and his committee role, had become a quiet intermediary, someone who understood which parcels flooded, which agreements were informal, and which landowners had been compensating for deficiencies themselves. This knowledge was practical but sensitive. It placed him in possession of details that were not easily reduced to paperwork. One property in particular drew renewed attention. It sat adjacent to Willow Creek, downstream from the proposed storage facility site. The land belonged to a family trust managed by Michael Lawson, a second-generation owner who leased portions of the acreage to contractors for staging and equipment storage. Recent heavy rains had caused repeated overflow onto the property, damaging stored materials. Complaints had been filed, but responsibility was diffuse, spread across outdated agreements and verbal assurances. Investigators discovered that Harper had visited the property twice in the month before his death, visits not reflected in zoning records. The visits were logged only indirectly, through fuel receipts and a brief mention in his notes about creek alignment. When Lawson was interviewed, he acknowledged meeting Harper, but described the interactions as cordial and unresolved. He denied any confrontation and provided an alibi that placed him at home the night Harper was killed. What complicated matters was not contradiction, but alignment. Lawson's account matched available records closely enough to defy easy dismissal. Yet the overlap between his property interests and Harper's presence along Willow Creek could not be ignored. Investigators widened their scope to include contractors who had access to the land and familiarity with the creek's conditions. Among them was Thomas Keller, a site supervisor who had overseen drainage work for multiple clients in the area. Keller's schedule placed him off duty the evening of Harper's death, though he acknowledged being near the creek earlier that week. His familiarity with the terrain was extensive. He knew where the ground softened after rain, where equipment could pass unnoticed, where visibility dropped off after dusk. None of this was incriminating on its own, but it established capability. As interviews accumulated, a pattern emerged. Harper had been attempting to broker an informal solution to the drainage problem, one that would satisfy landowners without triggering delays or regulatory review. Such solutions relied on cooperation and discretion. They also relied on trust. If that trust faltered, the consequences would not necessarily be public, but they could be severe. The coroner's final report added a critical detail. The blunt force injury had been delivered by a narrow, elongated object, consistent with a tool rather than a fist or blunt surface. The lack of additional injuries suggested a single, decisive blow. This was not a struggle that escalated. It was an act that ended the encounter immediately. Investigators revisited tool inventories and equipment logs from contractors working near Willow Creek. Nothing was reported missing. Tools were commonplace, interchangeable, difficult to trace. The absence of a weapon reinforced the likelihood that it had been carried away, not discarded. This, too, suggested deliberation rather than panic. By now, the investigation had narrowed to a small group of individuals whose interests intersected with Harper's unofficial efforts. None of them fit the profile of a volatile offender. They were practical men, accustomed to solving problems through negotiation or workaround. The possibility that one of those negotiations had failed catastrophically was difficult to reconcile, but increasingly unavoidable. The town sensed the shift. Patrol cars lingered near the southern edge more often. Conversations grew more guarded. People understood that the case was no longer abstract, no longer about an unknown threat. It was about proximity and familiarity, about disputes that had seemed manageable until they were not. For investigators, the challenge was evidentiary. Motive could be inferred. Opportunity could be established. What remained elusive was the moment of decision, the instant when a discussion along a familiar creek turned irrevocable. Without witnesses or physical proof, the case hovered in a state of near resolution, its outline visible but unfilled. As the third week ended, Sheriff Reed acknowledged privately that the investigation had reached a critical juncture. The answer was close, bound to the land and the quiet agreements that governed it. The final task was not to uncover something hidden far away, but to determine which of the known actors had crossed a line they could not retreat from, and why Daniel Harper had been the one left behind at the water's edge. The resolution of the case did not arrive through a single revelation, but through accumulation, the slow tightening of inferences until one explanation remained viable. Investigators returned again to the premise that Daniel Harper's death was the consequence of a private attempt to resolve a public problem. The question narrowed to which of those involved stood to lose the most if Harper's efforts succeeded or failed. Financial records from the storage facility project provided the final context. While the development itself was modest, the drainage adjustments required to protect adjacent properties were not. Updated assessments showed that correcting the overflow along Willow Creek would require regrading and culvert replacement that exceeded initial estimates. These costs had not been formally assigned. They existed in a gray space, dependent on negotiations that Harper had been quietly facilitating. Among the contractors involved, Thomas Keller's role became increasingly distinct. His company had been responsible for preliminary grading near the creek months earlier, work that, according to updated surveys, had exacerbated the overflow. Correcting that work would have required admitting error and absorbing additional cost, a prospect that had not yet surfaced publicly. Investigators discovered that Keller had been operating under a series of informal assurances that the drainage would be adjusted later, assurances that Harper had been attempting to formalize. The timeline tightened. Phone records revealed that Keller had attempted to contact Harper twice on the afternoon of his death, calls that went unanswered. Later that evening, Keller's phone registered briefly near Willow Creek, a location he initially attributed to poor signal routing. The data alone was inconclusive, but it aligned with other elements that had begun to cohere. Investigators reconstructed the likely sequence. Harper, aware of the escalating drainage problem and the reluctance to address it openly, arranged a meeting along the creek to demonstrate the issue directly. The location offered clarity without publicity. For Harper, it was a practical choice. For Keller, it represented exposure. Standing at the water's edge, the consequences of earlier decisions would have been impossible to deflect. What occurred during that meeting was brief. The coroner's findings suggested no prolonged altercation, no signs of mutual violence. The single, decisive blow indicated an impulsive act triggered by immediate pressure rather than premeditated intent. The tool used was never recovered, likely returned to routine use or discarded far from the scene. Its ordinariness was its protection. After the blow, the act of leaving Harper at the creek was not concealment, but conclusion. Keller knew the area well enough to understand that discovery was inevitable. What mattered in that moment was distance rather than disappearance. By placing the body where it lay, he avoided drawing attention to any other site, any other context that might implicate him directly. The case moved forward not with a confession, but with convergence. Confronted with the totality of the evidence, Keller's accounts began to fracture under their own precision. Minor discrepancies emerged, not dramatic enough to announce guilt, but consistent enough to undermine credibility. Combined with the phone data, the financial motive, and the physical feasibility, they formed a narrative that could withstand scrutiny. The arrest came quietly, without spectacle. Briarfield learned of it through official channels, the announcement measured and restrained. There was no sense of relief so much as resignation. The crime, once abstract, had resolved into something comprehensible and therefore more troubling. It had not come from outside the town or from malice untethered to reason. It had come from the pressure to contain a problem before it became unmanageable. In the end, the case was defined less by violence than by avoidance. Daniel Harper had occupied a role that required patience and discretion, qualities that had served the town well until they placed him alone at the center of unresolved responsibility. His effort to prevent conflict had drawn him into one, and the quiet setting he chose for resolution became the site of its failure. The creek returned to its routine flow. Repairs were made, this time formally, documented and inspected. The storage facility proceeded with adjustments that reflected costs long deferred. Briarfield resumed its patterns, altered subtly by the knowledge of what had occurred but unwilling to dwell on it. For investigators, the case closed without ambiguity. The evidence supported the conclusion, and the process had held. Yet the lingering impression was not of triumph, but of caution. The crime had revealed how easily familiarity could obscure risk, how the mechanisms designed to keep peace could also concentrate it. Daniel Harper's death did not transform Briarfield. It clarified it. The town remained quiet, orderly, and routine-driven. What changed was the understanding that even in places shaped by predictability, the most consequential moments often unfold without witnesses, along paths so familiar they no longer register as places where something can go wrong. Now, let's get into the next story tonight. The town of Alder Reach had never been defined by an event. It existed instead in the space between things, a place where days passed without distinction and memory settled gently rather than sharply. It sat along a shallow river that widened just enough at its bend to reflect the sky, bordered by aging pines and low commercial buildings whose signs had not been updated in decades. Nothing about it invited attention, and that was precisely how its residents preferred it. On the morning of October 14th, the air was cool, but not yet cold. The river carried fallen leaves in slow rotation, and the fog lifted gradually, as it always did, revealing streets that appeared unchanged from the night before. People went to work. A school bus ran its route. A bakery opened its doors at the same time it had for years. There was no immediate sign that anything was wrong. It was not until nearly midday that absence became noticeable. Maren Holt was not a person who disappeared easily. At 42, she had built her life around predictability, not because she lacked imagination, but because she valued control. She worked as a regional archivist for a private historical trust, a job that required patience, attention to detail, and a willingness to remain unseen. Her days were measured by routine, her movements tracked not by devices, but by habit. She walked the same stretch of river each morning before work. She ate lunch at her desk. She returned home by 6. Her neighbors, though not close to her, recognized her by sight and schedule. When she failed to arrive at the archive that morning, it was noticed, though not immediately escalated. She had taken personal days before. When she did not answer her phone, it raised mild concern but no alarm. It was only when evening came and her lights remained off that the pattern broke. By the following morning, the unease had spread beyond speculation and into something heavier, something that resisted reassurance. Her home showed no obvious signs of disruption. The front door was locked. The windows were closed. Inside, everything was arranged with the same care she applied to the rest of her life. Her coat was missing from its hook by the door. Her car was gone from the driveway. Nothing suggested a struggle. Nothing suggested departure either. The first call to local police was made by a colleague who had driven past Marin's house on the way to work and noticed the absence of her car for the second consecutive day. In a town where vehicles were as familiar as faces, this was not insignificant. An officer arrived shortly after, conducted a cursory check, and filed a preliminary report. At that stage, there was still room for benign explanations. By the third day, that room had closed. Bank activities ceased. Phone records showed no outgoing calls. No one had seen Marin walking along the river since the morning of the 14th. Surveillance cameras along Main Street captured her car heading east out of town at 7:12 a.m., exactly within her normal commuting window. The footage did not show her returning. The road east led away from Alder Reach and toward open land, then forest, then little else. It was a route few took unless they had reason to leave town entirely. Marin had no known appointments, no relatives in that direction, no documented plans. The car itself, a gray sedan with a minor dent along the rear panel, did not appear in any traffic cameras beyond the county line. It was this detail that shifted the case from local concern to something more unsettled. Vehicles did not simply vanish, not without effort or intention. Search teams were organized with quiet efficiency. Volunteers walked the riverbanks, scanned tree lines, and checked abandoned service roads. Flyers appeared in shop windows. Her photograph, taken from an old staff directory, showed a woman with a neutral expression that offered little insight into her inner life. She did not look like someone in danger. She did not look like someone running. As the days passed, the absence began to shape itself differently in the minds of those searching. What had initially felt like interruption now felt deliberate, though no one could yet explain by whom or why. Marin's life, when examined closely, did not present obvious fractures. She lived alone, but not in isolation. She maintained professional relationships. She paid her bills. She made plans weeks in advance. There was no note, no message, no hint of distress. Investigators began to reconstruct her final known movements with increasing precision. She had left her house at 6:48 a.m., consistent with previous mornings. A neighbor's door camera captured her walking to her car, carrying her usual shoulder bag. She appeared unhurried. There was no visible hesitation. She drove away without pause. That was the last confirmed sighting. Attention turned, inevitably, to the nature of Marin's work. The archives she managed were not public, but neither were they secret. They contained collections acquired from estates, small institutions, and defunct organizations, old letters, business records, personal journals, material that was often mundane, occasionally revealing, but rarely controversial. Still, the idea of hidden knowledge carried weight in the absence of clearer explanations. Colleagues described her as methodical, cautious, and deeply private. She did not socialize widely, but she was not withdrawn. She kept conversations focused on the present. She did not speak about her past. There were no known conflicts, no recent disciplinary actions, no disputes that stood out. As the investigation continued, a subtle shift occurred within the town itself. The routines that once felt comforting now seemed brittle. People locked doors more carefully. They took different routes home. Conversations lowered when patrol cars passed. The river, once a source of calm, began to feel like a boundary rather than a feature. Law enforcement expanded the search radius. Ground teams moved deeper into the forest east of town. Aerial sweeps were conducted along logging roads that had not been used in years. Nothing was found. No vehicle. No personal items. No trace of disturbance that could be reliably connected to Marin Holt. The absence, now stretching into its second week, resisted narrative. There was no clear beginning beyond an ordinary morning, and no clear direction beyond an empty road. Investigators were left with fragments that did not yet align, and a growing awareness that whatever had happened had done so quietly, without witnesses and without urgency. In Alder Reach, time continued to pass, but it did so unevenly. Each day without answers added weight to the one before it. The case had not yet revealed its shape, but it had begun to exert pressure, drawing attention toward details that had once seemed insignificant, and toward the unsettling possibility that the truth, when it emerged, would not announce itself all at once. It would require patience, and it would require looking not only at what was missing, but at what had been overlooked all along. By the third week, the investigation had settled into a quieter phase, one defined less by movement than by review. The search grids remained active, but the initial urgency had faded into something more procedural. What replaced it was scrutiny. Investigators began to look backward rather than outward, combing through the details of Marin Holt's life, with an attention that had not previously been necessary. Her house became the first fixed point. Though it had been entered briefly during the initial wellness check, a full examination had been delayed until the case was formally classified as a missing person investigation under suspicious circumstances. When it was finally conducted, the process revealed more through what it lacked than what it offered. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken objects, no disrupted spaces. The refrigerator contained recently purchased groceries. Her calendar showed appointments scheduled weeks into the future, including a notation for a medical checkup the following month. Nothing suggested an intention to leave. Investigators paid particular attention to her office space. Marin worked from home several evenings a week, and her study reflected the same order found throughout the rest of the house. Bookshelves were arranged by subject and date. File boxes were labeled in her handwriting. Her personal computer showed no unusual activity in the days leading up to her disappearance. Internet searches were routine. Emails were professional, restrained, and unremarkable. It was only when they examined her work-issued laptop that a small irregularity emerged. Several files related to a recently acquired collection had been accessed repeatedly in the week before she vanished. This was not unusual in itself. New acquisitions often required extended review. What drew attention was the nature of the material. The collection had come from a defunct regional planning council that had dissolved decades earlier. Its contents were largely administrative. Meeting minutes, land use proposals, correspondence between minor officials. Material of limited historical interest, but not entirely without significance. Marin had flagged several documents for further review, a step she typically reserved for items that required clarification or raised questions of provenance. Yet there was no record of her discussing the collection with colleagues, no request for additional resources, no notes explaining her interest. Whatever she had noticed, she had kept to herself. This discovery did not immediately redirect the investigation, but it altered its tone. The idea that Marin had encountered something unresolved, something that warranted closer attention, introduced the possibility of motive without yet providing one. It suggested that her disappearance might be connected not to who she was, but to what she had seen. Law enforcement began to reconstruct her professional interactions during the weeks leading up to October 14th. Interviews with coworkers revealed little beyond routine exchanges. She had attended meetings, completed assignments, and met deadlines. No one recalled her expressing concern or urgency. No one remembered her asking questions that stood out. She had not appeared distracted or anxious. Outside of work, her social circle was narrow but stable. She maintained regular contact with her sister, who lived several hours away, though the relationship was described as cordial rather than close. Their last conversation had taken place 3 days before Marin disappeared and had followed a familiar pattern. Brief updates, practical matters, no emotional intensity. Marin had made no mention of plans or worries. Neighbors were interviewed next. Most could offer only general observations. She was polite, quiet, consistent. She waved when passing. She collected her mail promptly. One neighbor recalled seeing her late one evening the week before she vanished, returning home later than usual, but the time was uncertain and the memory vague. No one reported unfamiliar vehicles or strangers in the area. As these interviews accumulated, a subtle problem emerged. Marin Holt was proving difficult to define beyond her routines. The investigation was attempting to understand her interior life through external patterns, and the results were thin. She had left little behind that hinted at inner conflict or concealed relationships. Her privacy, once unremarkable, now felt obstructive. Attention returned, repeatedly, to the morning she disappeared. Traffic analysis confirmed that her car had traveled east out of town, but the absence of further sightings remained unexplained. Investigators considered the possibility that she had deviated from the main road shortly after leaving Alder Reach. The surrounding area contained a network of old access roads, some poorly marked, others long abandoned. Many were remnants of logging operations from decades earlier. Some led nowhere. Others disappeared into forests that had since reclaimed them. Search teams revisited these routes with renewed focus, but the terrain complicated efforts. Dense undergrowth limited visibility. Recent rainfall had altered soil conditions, obscuring tire impressions that might once have been visible. The forest did not yield evidence easily, and it did not distinguish between what was recent and what was old. Meanwhile, the Archived Planning Council documents began to draw interest from outside the local department. A regional investigator with experience in historical land disputes was brought in to review the flagged files. Their assessment was cautious. The documents referenced zoning changes and infrastructure proposals that had never been fully implemented. Some parcels of land had been reclassified, others sold under unclear circumstances. None of it appeared overtly criminal, but there were inconsistencies, gaps where records should have been complete. One particular parcel appeared repeatedly in the correspondence, always indirectly. It was a stretch of land east of Alder Reach, bordering the same forested area now under search. Over the years, it had changed hands several times, often between shell entities with limited documentation. The land had never been developed. Its value, on paper, was minimal. Why Marin Holt had focused on this detail remained unclear. Investigators attempted to trace her activities in the days immediately preceding her disappearance with greater precision. Credit card records showed a fuel purchase 2 days before October 14th, made at a station on the eastern edge of town. This was not her usual location. The timing suggested she had gone out of her way to stop there. Surveillance footage from the station confirmed her presence. She appeared alone. She paid and left without incident. This detail raised new questions. Had she been planning a longer drive than usual? Had she already intended to travel east before the morning she disappeared? Or was the stop incidental, a coincidence magnified by circumstance? As these possibilities were weighed, the investigation remained constrained by its own caution. There was no crime scene, no evidence of violence, no definitive proof that a crime had occurred at all. The absence could still, in theory, be voluntary, yet each attempt to frame it as such faltered under the weight of what Marin had left behind. Her life was still waiting for her. By the end of the 4th week, the case had grown quieter in public, but more complex internally. Leads were followed, then set aside. Assumptions were tested and revised. The investigation was no longer asking where Marin Holt was, but what had altered her path so completely that she had vanished without leaving a trace. The answer, if it existed, was buried somewhere between her routines and her silence, in the space where attention had finally settled. The 5th week marked a shift that was not announced but felt. The investigation, constrained for so long by the absence of physical evidence, began to reorient itself around structure rather than discovery. Instead of searching for new information, investigators began to map what they already had, layering timelines, locations, and documents until patterns either emerged or collapsed under scrutiny. The parcel of land east of Alder Reach became central to this process. On paper it was unremarkable. A narrow tract bordered by forest on 3 sides and a seasonal access road on the 4th. It had no utilities, no permanent structures, and no active zoning designation. Its ownership history, however, was unusually complex for land of such limited value. Over a span of 30 years, it had been transferred multiple times between holding companies that appeared briefly in public records before dissolving or merging. Each transaction had been legal, or at least compliant on its surface, but the cumulative effect was obscurity. What unsettled investigators was not that the land had been hidden, but that it had been preserved. Comparable parcels in the area had been sold, developed, or absorbed into larger properties. This one remained unchanged, its boundaries intact, its purpose undefined. The Planning Council documents Marin had flagged referenced the parcel indirectly, often in the margins of broader infrastructure discussions. A proposed service road rerouted around it, a drainage plan altered to avoid it, a land survey amended without explanation. None of this suggested a single dramatic secret. It suggested persistence. Investigators began to examine the council members and consultants associated with those decisions. Most were retired. Some were deceased. A few had moved on to other regions, other careers. Their recollections, when available, were imprecise. They remembered debates, compromises, incomplete projects. They did not remember why that parcel had mattered. The land itself was searched again, this time with greater specificity. Rather than broad sweeps, teams focused on anomalies, depressions, irregular growth patterns, remnants of older paths. The forest resisted interpretation. It had grown without regard for human intention, erasing distinctions over time. What appeared significant one day dissolved into nothing the next. During this phase, a detail from Marin's personal records resurfaced with new relevance. Several months before her disappearance, she had requested copies of survey maps from the county clerk's office. The request had been routine, unremarkable at the time. Only in retrospect did it align with the Planning Council documents she had been reviewing. The maps covered a wide area, but the parcel east of town was included in all of them. There was no evidence she had visited the land in person, but the absence of evidence no longer felt reassuring. Investigators examined her phone's location data more closely, not for the day she vanished, but for the weeks before. The data was incomplete, limited by signal gaps and device settings, but it suggested occasional deviations from her usual routes. Short drives that did not align with work or errands. Movements eastward, then back, often at times when she would typically have been home. These deviations were not dramatic. They could easily have gone unnoticed. Yet when plotted together, they suggested a growing focus, a narrowing of attention. The possibility that Marin had been conducting her own quiet inquiry began to take shape. As an archivist, she was trained to follow paper trails to notice what was absent as much as what was present. She understood how records could obscure as effectively as they revealed. If she had encountered something unresolved in the Planning Council collection, it was conceivable she had pursued it independently, without involving colleagues or authorities. This raised a difficult question. If Marin had uncovered something significant, why had it not surfaced before? And if it had been worth concealing for decades, who had been responsible for that concealment? The investigation turned toward the entities that had owned the land. Corporate records were thin, but patterns emerged. Several of the holding companies shared addresses, legal representatives, or board members. The connections were not illegal, but they were circular, as though designed to maintain continuity without visibility. The land had effectively remained under the control of a small, shifting group, insulated from scrutiny by time and complexity. One name appeared more often than the others, always in peripheral roles. A consultant, a legal advisor, a signatory. He was not prominent, and his involvement never placed him at the center of any transaction. He had lived in Alder Reach during the early years of the Planning Council, and had since relocated. Attempts to contact him were initially unsuccessful. As these threads converged, the investigation's focus narrowed further. The question was no longer whether Marin's disappearance was connected to her work, but how directly. The absence of overt threats or warnings suggested that if she had been silenced, it had not been through confrontation. It would have required proximity, familiarity, and patience. Meanwhile, public attention waned. Without developments to report, the case receded from headlines. In Alder Reach, routines resumed, though they no longer felt quite the same. The river flowed as it always had. The forest stood unchanged. The absence of Marin Holt became part of the town's quiet, an unresolved space that people learned not to linger on. Within the investigation, however, momentum continued to build, slowly and unevenly. Each document reviewed, each connection traced, added weight to a growing conclusion. Marin had not vanished at random. Her disappearance was not an interruption imposed from outside, but the consequence of something she had stepped into willingly, guided by her own attention and restraint. She had followed a line of inquiry far enough that it had begun to intersect with something older, something that had endured precisely because it had never drawn focus. Whatever truth lay at the center of that endurance had not yet surfaced, but the investigation was now close enough to feel its outline. And outlines, once recognized, had a way of becoming unavoidable. The final stage of the investigation did not begin with discovery, but with confirmation. After weeks of attempts, contact was finally made with the former consultant, whose name had appeared repeatedly in the land records. He was in his late 70s, living alone in a coastal town several hours away. Age had reduced his mobility but not his awareness. When investigators spoke with him, his initial responses were cooperative and measured. He acknowledged his past involvement with the Regional Planning Council and the associated holding companies. He described them as administrative conveniences, products of an era when oversight was looser and long-term planning often relied on informal continuity. What changed the tone of the interview was not a question about Marin Holt, but a question about the land itself. The parcel east of Alder Reach, he explained, had once been earmarked for a project that never progressed beyond preliminary stages. The details he offered were imprecise, framed as faded memory rather than evasion. Yet when pressed on why the land had been consistently excluded from development, his explanations became less certain. He spoke of agreements, of understandings that had not been formalized, of decisions made to avoid reopening matters that were already resolved. Investigators did not confront him with accusations. Instead, they returned to the land. This time, the search was informed not by maps or records, but by inference. If the parcel had been preserved rather than ignored, it suggested not concealment in the conventional sense, but containment. The goal had not been to hide something from view entirely, but to ensure it was never disturbed. Using historical aerial imagery, analysts identified a subtle irregularity near the parcel's western edge. Decades earlier, the ground there had appeared uneven, briefly altered before being smoothed over in subsequent years. The change was minor, easily attributed to natural variation. On the ground, it was invisible without precise coordinates. Excavation was authorized. Beneath a shallow layer of soil, investigators uncovered remnants that did not belong to the forest. Degraded construction material, rusted fasteners. Evidence of a structure that had existed briefly and then been dismantled. Beneath that, deeper and more carefully placed, were human remains. The forensic assessment that followed was necessarily limited. Time had erased many details. The remains were determined to belong to an adult, sex undetermined, and had been buried for several decades. There were no identifying artifacts, no personal effects. Cause of death could not be conclusively established. What could be established was intent. The burial had been deliberate, concealed, and protected from disturbance by subsequent land use decisions. This discovery reframed everything that followed. The former consultant was interviewed again, this time with the excavation results disclosed. His response was subdued rather than defensive. He did not deny knowledge of the burial. He described it as an event that had occurred during a period of disarray, when oversight had failed and responsibility had been diffuse. The death, he suggested, had been the result of negligence rather than violence, an incident that had escalated beyond control. Rather than report it, a small group had chosen preservation. The land had been isolated, its status quietly maintained to ensure nothing beneath it would be uncovered. Over time, the act had transformed from concealment into routine. The reason faded, but the structure remained. Maureen Holt had encountered that structure. Through her work, she had noticed the inconsistencies, the repeated avoidance of a single parcel across unrelated documents. She had traced the pattern not to a single crime, but to a long-standing effort to keep something untouched. Her training had not compelled her to act quickly or publicly. Instead, she had done what she always did. She had followed the records. Phone data and fuel purchases now aligned with this understanding. Marin had driven east not to escape, but to confirm. She had likely visited the land alone, guided by maps and inference rather than certainty. What she found there could not be known with precision, but investigators concluded she had identified the burial site or something close enough to confirm her suspicions. Her disappearance occurred shortly thereafter. The former consultant did not describe a confrontation. He described a decision. Marin, he said, had contacted him, having traced his name through the records. She had not threatened exposure. She had sought explanation. In doing so, she had become a liability, not because of malice, but because of inevitability. Once the pattern had been recognized, it could not be unseen. What followed was not impulsive. It was quiet, planned, and consistent with the same logic that had preserved the land for decades. Marin was not buried at the site. Her absence was maintained differently, through dispersal rather than concealment. Her vehicle was dismantled and distributed through informal salvage networks. Her body was disposed of in a manner designed to leave no single point of recovery. The investigation could not substantiate every detail of this account. Time and method had ensured that much remained unverifiable. What could be established was responsibility. The consultant was charged not only for his role in Marin Holt's death, but for the earlier concealment that had set the precedent for it. Others connected to the original decision were beyond reach, protected by death or distance. Alder Reach did not change dramatically after the case concluded. There were no memorials, no public reckoning. The land east of town was reclassified and fenced, its history recorded rather than erased. The forest adjusted around the disruption and continued. Marin Holt's work was reviewed and archived in turn. Her notes, sparse but precise, revealed a mind that had trusted process and patience. She had not intended to disappear. She had intended to understand. In the end, what had endured for decades had not been a secret in the dramatic sense, but a decision sustained by habit and silence. It was that endurance, rather than any single act, that had shaped the outcome, and it was that endurance that Marin Holt, quietly and methodically, had brought to an end.